Hello and welcome to this part 2 video where I talk about the Cimbasso. If you haven't seen the previous video, then I encourage you to do so. In that video I talk a little bit about the history of Cimbassi and why they exist. But in this video I'm going to talk more specifically about this Cimbasso and what I found about it. So as mentioned briefly, this Cimbasso is in the key of E flat. It comes from a generic Chinese factory and it isn't a brand name instrument. It isn't sort of from a very prestigious European country or anything like that. But it is still a huge bucket load of fun. Now the only other Cimbasso that I've played is one made by Trent, however that name is supposed to be pronounced, and the differences between the two instruments are quite remarkable. But before I get into that, I'll go through a little bit about what we have here. We have a two-part instrument. We've got the bell section, which comes apart here, and this is a whopping great big bell section. It's just huge. Personally, if I was designing this, I'd probably make the bell a little bit closer to this tubing here because I don't think it needs to be this wide. The Trent Cimbasso that I've played had a bell a little bit closer in, so it was a little bit more compact to play because obviously this part dangles behind you somewhere, and having this part so far in front of you, it's quite unwieldy. What we also have moving down the instrument on the valve section is we have 5 rotary valves. You have the bottom 4 are done by your fingers, and then the top one, the 5th valve, is actuated by your thumb. Around the back we have a trigger, and this trigger extends the 2nd valve tuning slide to aid with some of your intonation issues that you may encounter. On each side we have these rather stout bars. Now these are convenient as handles, but they're there predominantly to provide strength to the instrument. They are a brace, so they have quite a functional purpose. If you didn't have them, then all the stresses and strains from moving the instrument about would be borne by the valve section here, and you really wouldn't want that. So having these big solid bars on the side are very comfortable, but also functionally very important. Right down the bottom, we have a peg. Now this is extendable. There's a couple of wing nuts that tighten, and this is what the instrument rests on when you're playing. This is not really something that you can pick up and march to. It's not a very convenient instrument, so that peg is quite useful. It does mean you have to sit down whilst playing or have some platform that you're resting it on if you're standing. What you will have also noticed down the bottom is that there is an extra loop of tubing here. Now this is something that is only here because this instrument is in the key of E flat. Normally Cimbassi are in the key of F, but as I mentioned previously in the previous video, I wanted this in the key of E flat so that I can play it with my brass band colleagues. So going on to some of the things that I've found with this, my first suspicion is that the rest of the instrument, apart from that loop of tubing down the bottom, is exactly the same between the F and the E flat models. And I feel that's likely because all of the valve tuning slides need to be extended quite a lot for the instrument to play in tune. If this was done, shall I say, properly, all of these tuning slides would naturally be a little bit longer to compensate for the fact that the instrument is in a lower key, E flat instead of F. But I think they may have skipped that step and just added that extra loop down the bottom. It's a little bit annoying because you have to push in all of the tuning slides to get the thing in the case. Now this instrument was bought from a Chinese company / factory called Freighter Music, and they can be found on Alibaba and AliExpress, but do not buy from them. I cannot recommend them low enough. Does that make sense? I cannot not recommend them enough. And the reason why that is because their customer service is prompt when you're buying something from them, but their view of consumer rights is pretty poor. This instrument is arrived obviously in its case, and that case was inside a cardboard box, but there was no padding or protection between the case and the cardboard box. As a consequence, this got bashed up during shipping. This tube here, which sits right at the one end of the case, was crumpled in, and they ended up sending me a new tuning slide after much lamentation. There's some damage to the bell, to the top section of the bell here, that was caused during the shipping process. There's a solder joint here that had become detached that I had to repair, and I've just recently realized that there's another solder joint here that is also popped off that I'm going to have to fix as well. And it's so frustrating because shipping damage, it would have been so easy for them to avoid if they'd just wrapped the case in some bubble wrap or something like that before they put it into the box. They didn't do that, the instrument got damaged, and their general view for that was, well, tough. That's your problem, not mine. Now that's not the first time I've had that issue with Freighter Music. When I bought my contrabass trombone, I also bought it from them. And the same thing happened. They didn't bother really protecting the case, and so when the trombone arrived, there was a whole bunch of crinkles in the bell. And so if you watch any very old videos where I talk about that instrument, you may see some crinkles in the bell, and that was again caused by poor shipping practice. So yeah, 2 strikes. I would not recommend buying anything from Freighter Music, particularly if it's a big, heavy thing. This instrument is a real hoot to play. It is, if you enjoy playing bass trombone, then this is going to be something that you are going to absolutely love. You put a bit of wind through this instrument, it brightens up, you can make it sound like a very low bass trombone, and it is fantastic. It doesn't take a huge amount of effort either to make that sound, and it's just brilliant. And I put that down to the fact that there is the tubing profile through this is very cylindrical. Unlike a tuba where the tubing gets gradually wider and wider throughout the instrument, this stays cylindrical throughout most of it, and it enables you to get that very bright sound. The downside of that is that because of the construction of this, there is very little resistance or back pressure when you play. It's a very free-blowing instrument, which has the downside that it takes an entire lung's worth of air to make a phrase or a bar, or in some cases a single note. It uses air like it's going out of fashion. And if you are not accustomed to that and perhaps not particularly fit, you will find yourself getting very dizzy and very light-headed whilst playing. So you need to be a little bit aware that the instrument will take all you've got to give and then complain you haven't given enough in terms of airflow. The fun that you will feel will more than compensate for that, but it just means that when you're playing particularly low lyrical stuff where you might have a long phrase, boy, it's hard work. Interestingly, this was not the experience I found when I played Cervini Cimbasso. That one was in the key of F. And what I found playing that was that it had a very different experience. That instrument had a much more conical bell section. This was almost twice the size. It was like a euphonium bell through the profile just here. And that instrument was much tougher to play if you wanted to get that bright, brassy sound from it. If you wanted it to sound like a tuba, then that was easy. It could do that, it could make that sound, and it was very centered and very refined. But if you wanted to be a little bit crass and a little bit less refined in your playing, and perhaps play like a bass trombone, you couldn't do that on the Cervini. But that's what this instrument does, this particular one does exceptionally well. It is very easy and fun to play very bright, very brassy sounds. You may not want that though, so sort of horses for courses type thing. Being made in a Chinese factory, you can tell that it was assembled by people that were shall we say, inspired by other brands' instruments rather than a factory that does their own research and development. And why I think that, what makes me feel that, is that there are a few rather simple quality of life improvements that could have been made and perhaps should have been made if this instrument was trialled in the factory by a person who knew what they were doing rather than somebody just copying a blueprint. One of the examples of that is the thumb lever, the fifth valve lever here. Its pivot point is back here, and if I was rebuilding this instrument, I'd put it on the other side of this post here so that the pivot point is closer to your thumb. What that would do is mean that your thumb doesn't have to move as much to move the fifth valve. The throw of the first four valves are perfectly normal, but this fifth valve, the throw of that is quite a lot more. And your thumb, it's just not as natural. So making that pivot point a little bit closer to the valve would mean that your thumb doesn't have to move as much. It would articulate the valve a little bit faster, and in my view, it would be a little bit more comfortable. The other annoyance with the fifth valve, and something that I fixed myself, is that its position was deeply unnatural. When I got this, the thumb lever sticked out a whole lot higher, so if you wanted to put your thumb through the thumb ring, as you are supposed to do, you couldn't actually reach the fifth valve unless your thumb was about 1 millimeter thick, because it intercepted with the top of the ring. So I had to bend this down so that it was actually reachable, which was a little bit silly, and again something that, well, if somebody had ever picked up this instrument and played it, then hey, it could have been fixed. Another thing I would have liked to have seen improved is this trigger here. This extends the second valve tuning slide out, but as you can see, even with the second valve really thoroughly lubricated, it doesn't return particularly quickly, and I think that's just because the spring here is nowhere near as strong as it should be. Now I don't know if that's just an assembly issue, but even when I push the second valve down and therefore reduce any internal resistance inside or any air pressure issues, the spring is still quite slow to return the valve back to its natural position. Which is something, again, if anyone had tested this, they would have picked up and been able to resolve. Actually playing this instrument, I've mentioned how fun it is, but it's very strange to play. We talk about centering notes and slotting and all those sorts of things. When you pick up a brass instrument, you kind of know in your head what you need to do to get the sound that you want, how you have to think about the notes, how you have to prepare your embouchure and lips. This is unlike any other brass instrument that I've played. The way that you have to have your lips adjusted, the way you have to prepare for the notes is unlike anything that I've played before. And I've had that comment from a couple of other people who have played this. This is a magnet for split notes, because what you think you need to do to get the note that you want is just slightly different from what you actually have to do. And it's very difficult without sort of preparing and planning and really thinking through the playing process to hit a note and it come out straight. I've played this and I've split notes and plastered notes everywhere other than where they're supposed to be, and it can make a little bit of a fool out of you. Interestingly, when I played the Cimbasso, I didn't have that same problem. It still didn't feel exactly like a tuba. It still felt very different. I had to think about what I was doing a whole lot more, but it was a whole lot more refined and easier to play than this. My impression from playing this is that you can get it to do a lot tonally. You can play it quietly and make it sound like a small tuba, and then you can play it aggressively and make it sound exactly like a trombone, and you can get the full spectrum of colours in between that. But what you can't do is expect the instrument to do all the heavy lifting for you. You have to do that yourself. So it doesn't necessarily willingly do all of those things, but it can. Whereas when I was playing the Cimbasso, what I found is that the tonal spectrum was a lot narrower. You couldn't get it to do anything bright and brassy and cracky at all. It just wanted to play within quite a narrow spectrum. But if you played within those bounds, it would help you. In this instrument, it doesn't. It has a very different, unforgiving approach to it. So it's been a real learning curve, trying to accommodate this instrument's whims and peculiarities when I play. But as I say, it is hilariously fun. It is hugely enjoyable. When I took this caroling, I played, I think, 3 different caroling ensemble sessions with it. And despite the fact that the general members of the public don't have a clue the difference between one brass instrument and the next, I had people coming up to me every single time asking what on earth this was, because this was still different. They hadn't seen things like this, and whereas they might never have seen a baritone or a euphonium or whatever before, it didn't inspire that same interest. It's just cool. And so I've really enjoyed playing this, and even other members of the band, they've recognised the difference in sound that you get. One person described it as making the band sound more modern, which I guess to some people would be a crowning insult, but to me, I think that's quite cool. So once again, I want to send a huge thank you to Tom, who made this instrument possible. I've mentioned a number of things that are wrong with it, but those gripes and things, they are all minor compared to the absolute joy that it's been to play this instrument and to be able to share it with other people who are brave enough to do it. I have one person who I offered to play this, and he just wasn't brave enough to, so you know who you are. But to the rest of you, thank you so very much for watching.